Hello everyone. Now, do you all remember I mentioned that the US stock market has 4 scenarios? The first one is already out of the picture, and now we're looking at the second and third scenarios. The key to the second and third scenarios is on April 2nd. How many tariffs will Donald Trump implement? That's the question. And recently, his tone has softened. It seems like he might not increase them as much, so the US stock market has rebounded. Let's take a closer look at this situation. Finally, I'll share my conclusion with everyone. The conclusion is that suddenly, the tariffs set to take effect on April 2nd have been reduced. It might remove some tariffs targeting specific industries. That means, if I explain it to you, initially there were several things where they said, all across the board, tariffs would be added to all semiconductors, all cars, and all pharmaceuticals. Adding 25%, this might not work. Why? Because actually, the tariffs on these things mainly come from 15 countries. If they impose equivalent tariffs on these 15 countries, and then add this, it would be a double imposition. So, many people, especially importers, feel they can't handle it, right? So, when faced with two options, they chose reciprocal tariffs. First, because within these reciprocal tariffs, the tariffs on semiconductors, cars, and pharmaceuticals are already included. I'll explain it to everyone in a moment. The main focus is on imposing reciprocal tariffs on specific countries leading in trade. But what about Donald, the result for Donald Trump? If there's a compromise, his policies end up being ineffective, mainly because of the revenue from tariffs. It's not enough to offset the losses from tax cuts, so the country's deficit problem remains unresolved, right? Originally, he mentioned April 2nd as the Liberation Day, when he would implement reciprocal measures to balance U.S. tariffs with those of trade partners, specifically targeting the automotive and semiconductor sectors. It's unlikely that an announcement will be made on April 2nd because, let me explain to you, among these 15 discussions, including the EU and Japan, the tariffs on cars, have they been imposed? It also includes South Korea and Taiwan, so, have the tariffs on semiconductors been collected? Pharmaceuticals mainly come from Europe and India, so this is already included, so they just need to impose reciprocal tariffs. They have already achieved most of their objectives, but the White House plans to announce reciprocal tariffs on that day. The White House is quick to act, isn't it? In just a few days, they will advance the long-term threat of imposing tariffs on car imports, and also target tariffs on lumber and semiconductors. The Commerce Secretary mentioned April 2nd. In fact, a series of tariff policies are expected to include reciprocal tariffs and industry tariffs. Industry tariffs, that is, might be applied to certain importing countries. Right. And then there's the collection, which is actually included in the reciprocal tariffs. Let me tell you, Donald Trump's team believes they can use the president's economic power to immediately impose tariffs, although a final decision hasn't been made yet. Why are Donald Trump's policies so inconsistent? It's quite simple. Firstly, it's because those companies involved are heavily lobbying the White House and members of Congress, urging them not to take such extreme actions, constantly warning that the stock market will fall. Secondly, within Donald Trump's team, there are some people, after all, who advocate that tariffs are merely a bargaining chip, a means for negotiation, and not the end goal, just to force the other side into fair trade. It's not considered a means of revenue. These two forces combined, along with Donald Trump's efforts to bring back big manufacturing jobs and increase U.S. government revenue to reduce taxes. These two sides are constantly pulling against each other, constantly in a tug-of-war. Donald Trump said he might lower the reciprocal tariffs imposed on U.S. trade partners next month. and some countries might be granted exemptions. In the Oval Office, he mentioned that he might give the green light to many countries, allowing some trade partners to be exempted or have reduced tariffs. Additionally, he is, of course, also concerned about inflation and the stock market issues. He said it would be false to claim he isn't worried. And finally, he relented. Donald Trump has been in discussions with trade partners and American businesses for several weeks, maintaining a tough stance throughout. He informed officials from Canada and Mexico that reciprocal tariffs taking effect on April 2nd are unavoidable. I can tell you, Mexico will be exempt from a portion of them. Canada will also be exempt from a portion. A foreign official last week believed that the United States thinks that by showing a strong stance, all the way they will push you to the brink, and then you'll do whatever they say. In the end, when they finally relent, that's what it's called. Donald Trump's The Art of the Deal is about negotiating until you're at your limit, seeing how far you can concede, and only relenting at the very last moment. Last week, during a meeting with oil industry executives, attendees reported that he doesn't want to grant exemptions on tariff issues and would consider granting exemptions sporadically, which makes it very difficult to do business. Why is the oil industry so concerned about him? If oil doesn't get an exemption, it would be a big problem. The 4 million barrels of oil from Canada and the over 1 million barrels from Mexico, if taxed, would be a big problem. So they hope he will grant exemptions. This is what they hope for, but Donald Trump stated that exemptions cannot be granted, only temporary exemptions. What does that mean? When oil prices are high, they grant exemptions, which makes it very difficult to do business. Many lobbyists from Fortune 500 companies have already called White House officials, asking how we can get exemptions. April 2nd is approaching, just a week away, and many countries are involved. They are in talks with the EU, China, and India. Donald Trump is focusing on imposing tariffs on companies with about a 15% long-term trade surplus with the United States. This particular move is referred to as 3015. The U.S. government has not released a list, but it is estimated which countries are being targeted. The countries largely align with those announced by the U.S. trade representative at the federal level, including China, the EU, Mexico, Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Canada, India, and so on. Let's take a look. We know approximately how much percent tariff they collect in principle. China already has enough, with China collecting a 45% tariff on $295.4 billion. Second is Mexico. Mexico, right? There's a VAT of 16%. Let me explain why a value-added tax is considered a type of tariff. Because if something is produced in Mexico and sold in Mexico, it can be offset, right? That means the cost of those purchases is deducted. So if you import something, they immediately charge you 16%. So half of this is essentially a tariff, and roughly half of it is disadvantageous to imported goods. So I estimate that 10% is Mexico's tariff. Adding to that, I estimate another 10 to 12%, plus they need to impose at least 10 to 15% tariffs on goods imported from China. This is the second major one, and they will definitely implement it. Because if they want to balance the trade deficit, these countries must implement it. All right, Vietnam is in trouble, with 9 to 10%. 9 to 10% VAT, 10%, Vietnam has to endure at least 15%. Vietnam can impose a 10% tariff on Chinese goods to prevent Chinese tariffs from being redirected through Vietnam, which would be 10 to 15%, similar to the 3 to 4% in the EU, and consistent with the US. But for cars, it's 10%. So, cars coming from the EU will definitely have a VAT of 23%, which is a big deal. In the US, EU cars are at 2 to 3%. There's an 8% difference here, and a 10% difference here. EU cars are at 20%, possibly 15 to 20%, so you solve a big part of the problem. This. Oh, Ireland. Sorry, I misspoke. Ireland, right. This one has a VAT of 23%, which is shocking for Ireland's pharmaceuticals, mainly around 15%. Ireland is shocked by North Point. VAT is 19%. Germany's car tariff is 10%. This German car tariff is 20% because it mainly targets car tariffs targeting two countries, which are Germany and Japan, and then other things are around 10%. This is shocking. In Taiwan, it's 5%. Taiwan doesn't have VAT. Is this table wrong? Taiwan has a sales tax that can't be deducted. So Taiwan might collect 5 to 10% because TSMC is investing, right? Very compliant, right? Oh, Japan. The tariff that easily drops very low is 25% on beef. In Japan, the consumption tax is 10%. Japan might be 10%. In South Korea, it's 0%, but the VAT is 10%. They say South Korea collects 4 times the tax on cars. Let me tell you, in semiconductors, 2 things: taxes will take a toll on you, and cars at least have a 15% levy. Kia forces you to set up a factory, right? This semiconductor is 10 to 15%. When it comes to Canada, there's no need to say much. In Canada, oil doesn't get a GST exemption, which is actually quite low. Canada imposes a 10% tax, and they ask Canada not to retaliate. There are some situations in Canada that are relatively better, while in India, 15% is quite high. Wow, GST is a sales tax of 18%, and India might charge 10%. Italy has a VAT of 22%. It might be 10%. Thailand charges 10%. Thailand charges 10%. Switzerland. Oh, Switzerland doesn't charge, something like that. Except for agricultural products, Malaysia has a 6% sales tax. 6%. Malaysia will require collecting Chinese tariffs, possibly charging 5 to 10%. Indonesia charges 8% AD and 10%. Indonesia charges back 10%. All these measures are actually targeting all the major semiconductor and automotive issues. But when doing this right, I estimate that the tariffs they added this year are 2 things, effectively adding 20% to China. And with the steel and aluminum tariffs, how much money did they collect? Approximately $120 billion US. I think they need to collect at least $300 billion US. Aiming to bring in $300 billion US from these things. Their goal is to collect at least $450 billion US, which would fill the gap from the tax cuts. This year's deficit was originally $1.8 trillion. He hopes to reduce the deficit by $500 billion, bringing it down to just over $1.3 trillion. And then Elon Musk reduced it by $200 to $300 billion, hoping to bring the deficit below $1 trillion. Meanwhile, I hope inflation won't rise, and then interest rates can be reduced. If interest rates are reduced by 1%, that would save $200 to $300 billion. Do you think that's impressive? It seems like they're taking a more balanced approach. The reciprocal tariffs are now more targeted. It still impacts countries that account for a large portion of US imports. I can tell you, China is taking a significant hit. China is taking a significant hit because it now accounts for over 40%. Then they will demand that Vietnam, Mexico, and Malaysia impose tariffs on China. Even changing the country of origin doesn't work. In fact, going through these countries to the US results in an actual gain of $800 billion. As long as it drops by 7%, China is already severely impacted. The first major impact is on China. The second is on the automotive industries in Europe, Japan, and Korea. And the third is on Vietnam and Malaysia, as they continue to take on China's export business. Additionally, South Korea's semiconductor industry is also affected. The US government might raise tariffs on April 2nd to levels not seen in decades. This will significantly prompt businesses to say, hey, announce it quickly, it's been added already, then I'll know what to do. This is the situation. Lobbyists suggest that clients should directly approach senior officials at the White House or the Department of Commerce to discuss how these tariffs are affecting their business and whether they can bring manufacturing operations back to the US within the next 6 months. This is simply impossible. It's just a scare tactic. Even if they start, they can't sign anything. Some things simply can't be signed. This is where investors are welcoming Donald Trump's latest tariff policy. All right. As for the range of import tariffs starting next week, reduction. US stocks have risen significantly, with major markets going up. The Dow Jones increased by 1.4, and the Standard & Poor's by 1.8. The Nasdaq reached 23,000. US Treasury yields have risen in the past 2 weeks. Originally, the interest on government bonds was falling. Now that the government bond yields are rising, what does that mean? It means that they expect there won't be a recession, and the rate cuts have slowed down. I know about the tech sector. When the stock market drops, it's the tech stocks that fall first. I'm telling you. What about Monday's big battle? The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index was down 3%, AMD down 7%, Nvidia down 3.2%, and TSMC down 2.5%. Look, everything's in the green. Tesla rose 12%, continuing the upward trend from last Friday. The Secretary of Commerce told people to buy Tesla stock. Well, it went back up to over $250. Just look at it. Going back to over $250 with a high of $488, $278, $278. The stock market seems like it will continue to rebound from overbought levels, and I agree that any alleviation of potential tariff impacts could serve as a catalyst for the rise. This is what Macquarie says, that the chaos of US tariff policy has peaked. The weekend developments seem to confirm that the normalization or rationalization of tariff policy is imminent. Morgan Stanley suggests to clients that the most severe phase of the recent downturn may be over. Let me share my conclusion with you all. I've been observing. Donald Trump is a persistent and resilient person. But does he really dare to stubbornly implement his entire tariff policy? I have my doubts. I've always suspected that Donald Trump might change his stance, and the result would be a compromise, creating some sort of middle course. This possibility is quite high. Originally, I said I would wait until April 2nd for him to make a decision before I decide on my stock investments. However, today I made a decision. So, I will issue an urgent notification immediately. For those $50 patrons, this is, and I will also explain what I think the stance should be. Okay,